Hello, everyone. I'm very excited to be here. I'm Verity Ritchie, pronouns they, them, and I'll be your host this evening. We have loads to talk about, so without further ado, let's introduce our panel. So I think we can go in alphabetical order, starting with April. Can each of you tell us your name, your pronouns, and your personal relationship to queer, particularly bisexual filmmaking and television?
Yeah, of course. Hi, everyone. My name is April Kelly. My pronouns are she, her, and I am very bisexual. I'm right down the middle, not swaying to either way, just fully bisexual. And I'm a filmmaker. I'm a writer and producer, and I first dipped my toe in waving the flag high for bisexuality with my short film Treacle, which premiered in 2019. And thereafter, I've always given bisexuality a nod in anything that we do.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Brendan?
Hey everybody, my name is Brendan Prost. My pronouns are he, him, and I've made several short films as a writer, director, and producer that explore bisexuality, but also I think explore like the complicated nature of desire and um, um, different types of connections that people forge between one another, regardless of gender. I've also written and directed some features that explore the subject, but we're still trying to get those off the ground, as I'm sure all the filmmakers in the room can connect to and relate to. But yeah, that's me.
Brilliant. And Henriette?
My name is Henrietta. I go by she, her. And my relationship to bisexuality, I'm bisexual myself. I started out by writing a lot for theatre, and because I didn't see any bisexual characters out there, I started exploring that in my theatre, which led me to do a TEDx talk about bisexuality in media and how proper representation creates healthier mental health for our community. Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. And Mariette?
I'm Maria Sanfilippo. I am a professor of media studies at Emerson College in Boston, and also very bisexual myself. And because as a professor in training, I had to write first a dissertation and then a book. I decided that I needed to write a book about bisexuality, a kind of serious academic treatment of bisexuality in film and television, because there wasn't one. And so that's precisely what I did. Here it is. And since then, I have been, continuing to write and think about bisexual representation. And precisely because directly after publishing that book, a film called Appropriate Behavior came out, and that film by Desiree Akhavan was the film that I had been looking for, not only my whole life, but definitely, when I was writing this book about bisexuality in film and television. But it had come out a bit too late. I decided I had to write a book about it. So I wrote a short book about it for the Queer Film Classics series, which I highly recommend checking out. I don't have my copy with me, so I can't hold it up, but I did wear my Desiree Akhavan t-shirt from Girls on Top today in honor of Akhavan. So thank you. Happy to be here.
Brilliant. Thank you all so much. Well, Maria, if you would like to continue, I think then we should start by asking you to tell us a bit about how bisexuality in film and television has changed over the last few decades. And is the issue of like bi-visibility still a problem in the same way that it was in the past?
Sure. Yeah. So, I think that actually maybe the question is more one of nameability than visibility, insofar as I've always thought that there is lots of bisexual representation out there. It's just not being regarded as such. That's precisely what I was arguing in my book. It's hidden in plain sight. It's just because we're viewing the world, and with it, film and television from a very mono-sexist, as I call it, lens, right? Where we're always thinking in these either or terms. And so it's there and always has been. But yeah, I mean, it is certainly more the case now that bisexually identified people are, gaining greater access to make their own work, that we have that, as we call it, like for us, by us form of representation that feels just a lot more authentic and accurate and experientially, you know, knowledgeable about the life that, you know, bisexuality confers. And so that's what was so meaningful to me about appropriate behavior. And there's other, you know, work like that that's, you know, coming out more regularly now. So in that sense, I think that visibility, yes, is improving. And that's not to say that somebody has to be waving the bi flag, or even, you know, that the B word, as I call it, right, is actually being, you know, articulated. But I would say that one thing that's really becoming more of a challenge to visibility, and we can talk about this more maybe if we talk about television specifically, is that the way that the, you know, media ecosystem has evolved, or maybe devolved is the word, that it's less and less likely that we're finding something because distribution is, you know, not bearing gaze so much as they're bearing films in, you know, these nether regions of Netflix or what have you, or that television series are getting cut off, right, prematurely once they become, you know, expensive to continue producing. So this idea that, you know, bisexuality is just a phase, it's something that used to be levied as a slur, or still is, I guess, but now it's becoming just a phase in the sense that these opportunities for bi representation are getting cut off or buried in a way that, you know, is more an industry related concern that I have about contemporary visibility.
Does anyone else have anything that they would like to add about how things have changed?
I think, bouncing off of what Maria is saying, I do personally think that there is, I would say, a more accurate representation where bisexuality is not just being in a limbo, or you're just not quite gay yet, or you're not straight. It's not either or in the same way as I felt like the representation was when I grew up, meaning that when I first developed feeling for a woman, I thought, okay, well then I must be gay, because I've never seen that you can be attracted to both. So I feel now with TV shows like Schitt's Creek really kind of paved the way to show a different way of showing bisexuality. It's not so much about having to choose or pick, but it's about the person they fell in love with. And there's no, I think also the next piece, there's no trauma related to the sexuality. There might be stuff happening around these characters, but it's not because of their sexuality. And I think for me, I see it as a really important shift in how you look at queerness and bisexuality in TV.
So we've got things like Alice Oseman's Heartstopper now, and as well as stuff like Desiree Akhavan's Appropriate Behavior and The Bisexual, and that's a pretty broad spectrum of what might be considered sort of good representation of bisexuality. So I was wondering if each of you could tell me what are your priorities when it comes to what qualifies as quality representation of bi characters, and are there tropes and stereotypes which should be avoided, or is it possible to write anything as long as it's done well?
Firstly, Verity, you put together incredible questions, very articulate, very detailed. I feel like, and also just to add to one of those shows, most recently, This Way Up with Sharon Horgan's character, I thought was really interesting. I personally feel most seen when it's dealt with in just a couple of comments, just not making a song and dance of it. Just I feel like when I explore sexuality in our work, it could just be as simple as someone acknowledging that they don't know what they are, and they're still going through that process, instead of making it a definite thing. And in terms of tropes and stereotypes, you actually, Verity, later on touch on this in terms of love triangles, and as we also just said with Maria, this whole phase thing, and I feel like it doesn't have to be as difficult as everyone is making it out to be. It really is simple more simple. You don't have to make a song and dance of it. But I feel like with bisexuality, because we're constantly, well, I feel I'm constantly defending my sexuality. I feel like there is a need that in these shows or films to really spell it out and be on the nose. Yeah, so I am hopeful, but I might be one of the most cynical people on this panel. So I do apologize. It's very early where I am. So I'm just angry. Thank you.
I would say that, the thing that stands out to me is is authenticity based on like lived experience and like direct observation. I think audiences are really sophisticated now, and they can tell intuitively right away when something is not true to their own life and the things that they've observed, and the things that they've experienced. So to me, I really feel like you can embrace like a fairly wide swath of representation as long as you're doing so, in a non-performative, authentic way. I think like characters who are flawed and super shitty sometimes are totally fine and welcome in art and in cinema. Like, I don't think it's the job of film and filmmakers to like offer up the moral instruction manual and be like this. This is the way life should be. I think it's important to get into the nitty gritty and the complicated and the weird. And I think as long as you're doing that from a place of like, again, just like authenticity, and it's hard to like define what that means, but I think audiences know, they're intuitive and they're sophisticated, especially when you're speaking to a very particular and like very specific experience. So lastly, I think just like in my own work, I always just try to emphasize like experience over identity, because I may not necessarily like, have the same experience of bisexuality and my identity that other bisexual folks do. But what I do know really well is like the nuances and the emotions that go with my experience, and I just try to embed that in the work in a way that is truthful to me.
I also touched upon it a little bit before when I spoke, but I think for me in my writing and what I like to see on screen is characters that are bisexual, but we don't necessarily need to mention it. We don't need to have that be the center of attention. They can go about their day, be bisexual, and it might be a comment here and there of like, oh, how was your date last night? Oh yeah, no, she was great. But are you still seeing that guy? I don't know. You can do it in many ways where it does become about a love triangle or trauma. I think for me, I'm tired of the trauma with bisexuality, and I rather want to see functioning characters that may not function well because of other things that are happening in their lives. So that's where I am, because I don't think there's a right or wrong representation. But I think for me, I like to see more characters where it's not the drama plot. They just are. They could have also been a straight person, but we chose that this was a bisexual character instead.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what Brendan was saying about the, super shitty characters resonates with me. I mean, I like the messy human characterization that, women and queer men are finally getting to be, right? The anti-heroes, the unlikable, right, protagonists. So I'm sort of sympathetic to the whole disaster bisexual trope. I think, when done well, it can, beg the question of why are we seeing those characters as problematic? Why instead are we not seeing them as embracing, open desire, all the kinds of affirmative ways that, we might choose to live and still be caring individuals, as opposed to the ways that bisexuality has oftentimes gotten maligned as opportunistic or selfish or greedy. So I think there's always, possibility in even the more negative tropes. This coming from somebody whose, favorite bisexual figure, in my foundational years was the vampire, the female vampire, who I always had to argue was bisexual, not lesbian, right? So, I think anything is recuperable if it's done well. That said, I also think that one really important marker of progress has been allowing bisexuals to have more fleshed out and intersectional identities, right? Where they're not defined by their bisexuality. This is echoing some of what has already been said. But yeah, certainly that, the other aspects of their life are always intruding upon their bisexuality and vice versa, because that's the way, our selfhood works. And it's one reason that I think I really connected with Akhavan's work, because as a first generation person, as she is, although from different, ethnic backgrounds, trying to kind of code switch or shape shift or, live in two worlds by being true to yourself in both, but not really wanted in either, right? That kind of sense of bisexuality is always between or beyond, and subject to biphobia from both straight and gay camps. That kind of acknowledgement has always been something that I've looked for in bisexual representation, because I think that does feel like a very authentic part of being bisexual.
Brendan, you brought up sort of the didacticism sometimes seen in LGBT media, and I think this is, I get a sense that there's a lot of pressure for film and television to be didactic when it comes to representation. Do any of you have opinions on the place of didacticism when representing bisexual characters, and how does that impact writing an authentic bisexual experience?
The thing that stands out to me is one of the things I love about writing bisexual characters is that they demand that the audience be really curious, and kind of lean forward and interpret behavior beyond the lens of like their first like impulse to understand, and that curiosity is like really good, but it's really bad for like corporate media. Like we hear so much now about how everything needs to be simpler and easier because audiences are watching while they're doing the dishes or whatever, and even in like kind of cultural funding systems that I'm a part of in Canada, it seems like there's this need to like simplify and dumb down for audiences, when I think the exciting thing about like writing about like queer and like bisexual specific experiences is like it's not simple. It's complicated. Knowing oneself and knowing what one wants from someone else, particularly when you find yourself open to connections of all kinds with people of all genders, is like a thrilling challenge. And I don't like the impulse to have characters have to like name themselves or you know like sum up and synthesize their experience in words when words will never do. And I think that's one of the things I love about cinema, is that it can be unspoken and it can be complicated, and it demands the audience to activate their imagination, their curiosity, and overcome their initial biases and preconceptions. So yeah, I don't know. In Canada, I definitely feel that within the funding system, and I definitely observe that in the corporate media ecosystem that I consume and enjoy.
I think that's why so much of the good early bisexual representation I found, at least, came from art cinema, um, which, some have said we now find in television, right? That television has kind of taken up a lot of the mantle of what art cinema used to do. Um, and that's precisely, as Brendan, you were saying, right? It's complicated. It doesn't explain characters to us or give us easy resolutions or pat answers to life's, conundrums. And people are always changing, right? And so, and I think one really important thing that bisexuality recognizes is that orienting your entire identity around gender fetishism, which is what monosexuals do, in my opinion, it doesn't leave you open to all of the other ways in which we are, determining our life paths, and with it, right, our partners or our, love affairs or what have you. And so really, keeping characters ambiguous, not because they're being evasive or, two-sided, but because people find it very difficult to know themselves, let alone one another. And that's a beautiful thing. It's why we're mysterious and endless in our depths. And thus, I think really activating of curiosity and of spectators who don't want didacticism, who don't want things just explained to them in a way that's simple and honestly quite false as a result.
Just to follow on with that as well, and what Brendan was saying, and the impact of writing an authentic experience for me, and I've said this time and time again, and also what you said, Brendan, about simplifying content at the moment, especially television. Just get some bisexuals in the writing room. It's as simple as that. If you can, and it's so easy. It's me angry again. Just get some bisexuals in the writing room, and immediately you will start getting an authentic storyline woven with a bigger ensemble cast or whatever it is.
I think I'll jump in on that. I completely agree. Start getting some bisexual people in to write bisexual characters, or at least support writing bisexual characters. It does seem quite simple, but I think what we're also touching upon is that it's bigger than just bisexual representation. There's an issue in the industry right now, because whether you're bisexual or straight or gay, you will always be complex because you're a person. And if you don't allow for that complexity to shine through, we are going to have to tell people rather than show them. And when that happens, people disengage. The characters feel flat. They don't feel like they are representing an actual person. And then that's when we fall in the pit hole of misrepresenting bisexuals as well. So we need those complex storylines. And I actually completely disagree with all the streaming platforms. I think they're digging their own grave by trying to simplify it, because audiences aren't dumb. And sometimes we do want to put on a dumb film because we are hungover or we're tired or whatever. But mostly we talk about the films and TV shows that inspire us. So they should be focusing more on that. Otherwise, they will just, again, dig their own grave. That's my opinion.
So it tends to be that it tends to be much easier to communicate that a character is straight or gay than it is to communicate that they're bisexual. But what are some ways, I want to think about some ways that you can communicate bisexuality to an audience, because a man and a woman kissing will usually be read as straight, right? And two women kissing will be read as gay. And popular bisexual narratives, even today, tend to be represented by love triangles and infidelity and non-monogamy. It tends to be this like image of the three. Even very recent films like Challengers, Poor Things, Passages, Saltburn. Are there alternative ways of representing bisexuality? I think we touched on this a little bit already. But is the love triangle storytelling kind of inevitable for the sake of like visually communicating bisexuality? And is this, Maria, you mentioned this already a little bit, like television versus film. And we have some short filmmakers here. Like I think there must be quite a difference in trying to communicate very quickly in a short film and in a long story format like television.
Yeah, I mean, as I've said in my book and writing on television, it's not that television makes bisexuality more viable or legitimate if you have that serial format that allows for longer form storytelling, but it just makes it more legible, right? It's easier for us to see bisexuality for the reason that you were just describing, right? We'll have the time in which to spend with a character over multiple relationships. And, that doesn't necessarily mean that somebody is more bisexual than, another person who has one relationship or who only dates women in their life, but still identifies as bi. But it's just a kind of easier, I don't know, narrative structure in which to explore bisexuality. I've found in my research.
I tend to lean on friendships when it comes to exploring bisexuality and making sure that those friends aren't completely ignorant. But that's a far more, no, I wouldn't say more authentic, but it just allows a different conversation. So, for example, at the top of Treacle, the bisexual character gets a text from Jamie, and the other character goes, "Is this boy or girl, Jamie?" And it's like, oh, this is boy Jamie, I went out with girl Jamie on Thursday, and like immediately there it's chill. So that's my answer to it, working through friendships.
I also sometimes use the current relationship to cast light on it. The previous thing that I'm currently working on is a relationship between a guy and a girl. She's bisexual, and at one point he's like, you never talk about your ex, because there is something there, unresolved, whatever. And she says, well, you never talk about your ex. And then he's like, well, why don't you ever say anything about her? Whatever. I don't remember the lines right now. This sounds shit. But it can just be those little things of like, yeah, you never talk about her. It's like, well, yeah, and you never talk about her either. Okay, let's just drop it and move on. So you can put on these small little gifts out there without it having to be spelled out. That can come through something else that is happening, like April also just touched upon.
I totally agree with what everyone else has said, but yeah, like there's the value of the love triangle because it creates, character conflict and all that. But to me, the most challenging thing about writing bisexual characters is avoiding them being really licentious and slutty. Like, because like the shorthand to reveal a character's identity or their, is to just have them express interest, like express desire. And like when you kind of over the course of a film or a show or whatever it is, have them, express desire towards, people of more than one gender, we kind of like catch on. They don't necessarily have to pursue it, but that kind of means that they can't just like be in a satisfied, content relationship, just like loving that one person, because we'd never get it. They have to be just a little bit slutty. They have to like want to flirt with multiple people, which I enjoy. It's like more truthful to my own experience. But I would one thing I've really been interested in is like, yeah, how do you just like tell the story of a bisexual character who's just like really in a nice satisfied relationship, and they have no desire to to be with anyone else. I find that kind of like a fun challenge.
We've talked a little bit about this already now, but so this is about crafting narratives, right? So if someone wants to write like a coming out scene in a way that feels authentic and not like it's pandering, how do you do that? How do you avoid feeling pandering or didactic?
I will approach this from somebody who studies not only bisexuality but rom-coms, because there's a lot of coming out rom-com scenes that I think bisexuality necessarily has to avoid. I'm thinking about the ones from straight or gay rom-com coming out films where everybody, cheers you on, or, you have some sort of revelation that now you're where you've always, been meant to be. And I feel like bisexuality just doesn't allow for that because, first of all, the world's not ready for us. And so we're not going to have the whole crowd clapping for us. But also because, I think bisexuality intuits something that's true of everyone, but isn't built into our construction of other identities, which is that sexuality, and I've said this already, it's not only fluid, but it's also ever changing. And so, a coming out isn't a finite moment that can end a film with the resolution that we're all reassured that everything is taken care of. It's going to be a process. You come out every day to more people, and it's a process even with the people that already know, because they are so kind of resistant or just kind of not, able to grasp our experience. And so I think the coming out is just going to be a really messy, cringy, even awkward and unresolved thing in films about bisexuality.
I feel like I have this sense that a bisexual storyline needs to kind of just fit the same kind of plot beats that like a gay story will. So that there's like coming out, and then but when you come out, you can't come out in the wrong direction because that feels like regressive, right? You have to come out as bisexual, but so that you can have a gay relationship. And it feels like kind of like we're trying to emulate something rather than make something unique, I think. Okay, so here's the next question. Is it enough to explore fluid sexual desire and the experience of bisexuality? We've kind of talked about this already as well. Or do we need narratives and characters that explicitly address a bisexual identity? And so we kind of talked about this already. I think, because I think there's kind of this, I kind of think of it as like a wikification of like sexuality, where like what we really want, we don't want so-and-so to appear to be bisexual on television. We want them to say they're bisexual, or maybe in the spin-off media it says they're bisexual, and then someone can put it on a wiki, and then it's on the list of official bisexuals, and then this list is separate from the pansexuals, and then the fluid people are separate as well. And, I mean, it's all so confusing. But how do you manage that? Like, do labels matter?
I personally feel like they matter, but I didn't when I was younger. I got shoved out the closet, and then I went running back in, and then I decided to come out the closet. But I went through a phase of being like, I'm fluid, and then I thought I was sapiosexual for a hot second, which was wild, and then I land on bisexuality. But I always say my early 20s would have been a hell of a lot easier if I knew bisexuality was a thing. I didn't even know it was actually a thing. You think it's a segue into lesbianism. So labels for me are very important, and to be a role model, even if it's just one person that comes across your work or hears us speaking today, that makes them feel seen and heard. I'm also very proud of it. And there's a running joke where it's, especially when I say I'm doing something like this, I said, but guys, it's rare, so you better log on. I don't talk about it. And so it's a running joke. But yes, I do believe labels are important, for me anyway.
I want to follow up on that because I completely agree. I grew up not knowing bisexuality was an actual thing. I thought it was, either a gateway to become gay, or it was your slutty phase before you go back to marry a guy. I didn't understand that it was where you could land and feel seen and heard. And if we don't use the labels in a way where people can identify with them, we just have all of these lost souls out there, including myself. I feel very lost for a long time. And just like April, like my early 20s would have been a lot more easier, or my late teens would have been a lot more easier if I understood the feelings that I had was completely normal and fitted in, not with the straight and not with the gay, but they had bisexuality as a box. So for me, I still think labels matter.
Yeah, I agree as well. I came of age in the time when, famously or infamously on the L Word, my then favorite character, Alice Piasecki, played by Alicia Haley, went from being bisexual to saying that bisexuality is gross. And, finding that really kind of, that betrayal, right, so hurtful. And that left us with like Tila Tequila as a role model. I mean, it was awful. It was a terrible time when nobody was stepping up. And so I really love that we have all of these, cool performers, willing to call themselves the B word. And, to that degree, I do think that it's worthwhile to have a show like The Bisexual call itself that, because it stemmed from Akavon's experience of having been constantly referred to as such when she was, promoting her first film. She was the bisexual Lena Dunham, right, at every PR, blitz. And instead of shirking that label, she leaned into it. She embraced it in all of its cringiness, because there's so much, icky attachments that have piled onto it over the years. And if we're ever going to kind of, rid ourselves of that, right, we have to keep using it in an affirmative sense that, reappropriates it for the meanings that we believe it has.
I maybe would just I feel somewhat differently in that, like, I think that it's more interesting for me for characters to define themselves by what they do, and less by what they say. And I also feel like, just kind of in life generally, I want someone to reveal themselves to me through their actions and their choices, and that's going to define who they are more so than kind of how they choose to synthesize and tie it all up for me in whatever their label is that they choose to embrace. And I also feel like sometimes it ends the conversation and ends the curiosity when you kind of like button it with that, and there's no longer like, but well, what about this or what about that, or like tell me more about this. It like yeah, I kind of I to me I like to like focus and emphasize on like a person's experience and like talking about that, because the other thing is I grew up Catholic, like repressed, a lot of internalized homophobia, and there's a lot of I think people moving through the world who probably are bisexual who are not ready to be out and not ready to talk about it in those terms, but may be willing to kind of just share, you know, some experiential things. And I think that's we need to be like patient and compassionate for that, because I need to exercise that patience and compassion for myself and people who've had that similar upbringing, that like they may not be ready to say that that's who they are, but they that doesn't change the fact that that is who they are and that is what they've experienced. So I think I just feel like maybe slightly different, but I definitely appreciate the value of like inspiring others through the claiming of that mantle. Um, but I also feel like, you know, there's something to like, emphasizing that people are who they are based on their choices and their actions, and not necessarily how they choose to define themselves in words and labels.
Can I speak to that? Because I completely agree with you, Brendan, and I think you make a really good point. I think for me personally, it's not so much about putting a label out there, being like, hi, I'm bisexual or pansexual or whatever people may identify or the characters may identify themselves with. But through their actions, as you're touching upon, they might also show what bisexuality is, which again, as you also talked about earlier, the curiosity and who's watching it is like, oh, that's interesting. They don't define themselves as gay or as straight. Is this bisexuality? And they might then go on and do their own little research to see what it is. So I feel like by having maybe the label as a writer, you create the character that carries the label without saying it, which I think is important.
Yeah, I totally agree. You as the writer and the creator, you always need to know, right? But it doesn't mean that it necessarily has to like define itself as such in the, the script. I love that. Great point.
Well, I think it's time to move on to some questions from our audience. So the first kind of question we have is from Jen. How important do you think it is to represent the stigmas bisexuals face around their sexuality versus having bi characters be freely themselves without facing problems around sexuality, even if this can sometimes feel idealistic?
I think we need both. I don't think there's one golden rule that would go for all. I think the issue is we have only been shown one side of the story, because there are love triangles. I was in a love triangle as a bisexual where there was a man and a woman, and so they do exist. They are equally valid. The issue is that we've only seen those stories. So we can have that, but we also need to see the bisexual that is not in a promiscuous relationship, or is cheating on their partner, or is suddenly discovering that, oh, actually now I like women, or actually now I like men, but they're confident in their sexualities, and it's not the storyline, it's not the bisexuality, it can be other things. So we need both. And that's why I mean there's not one right representation. The issue is we haven't shown the full representation yet.
Carice is asking, what are your thoughts on the representation of bisexual people of color in film and television?
There aren't enough of them. That's my thought. I mean, I think that's one of the things that I would say really needs work, is that bisexuality has always been tethered to white privilege. It's conflated in this sense, right? That there's some way in which, whiteness confers the ability to not have to be a role model or not have to be perfect and unflawed as a protagonist. And that, is one of the things that's still, I think, keeping bisexual representation back, along with it still being, to, I think, significant degree also tied to cisness and femness and, all the other kinds of conventional assumptions that continue to constrain representation from being more diverse and inclusive.
Do you think there's an element to which, like, if bisexuality is greedy and indulgent, is that part of how it gets kind of tied to whiteness as like this? Am I making any sense?
Yeah, that it's like entitlement, right? You know, that goes along with racial entitlement, it's bisexual privilege as well, right? That and again, you know, both doing away with that by divorcing, right? Having bi-ness and whiteness always right together. We'll do some of that work, as well as spinning, right, that story that it's opportunism or it's selfishness into something more that it is, you know, openness, that it is, you know, being desiring. Just, you know, kind of affirming rather than negating, right, these kinds of qualities in writing bisexuality, which I think will come from people who are bisexual writing more, right, characters, more storylines, as we've been saying, including people of color, of course.
Okay, so the next question is from Stephen. Is there any aspect of bisexuality you haven't seen represented or you think deserves more screen time?
One thing that stands out to me is like amorousness, or like love and romantic uh, connections, and not necessarily just like sexual. Feels like the shorthand of bisexuality is that like you want to fuck the other person. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that word here, but anyway. But I really enjoy, especially between other men, like love and romance between other men. That isn't necessarily like just like leading immediately to sex. So I love seeing, you know, films about bisexual characters, or, you know, television shows about bisexual characters who are like romantic and amorous first, because I think that's so unusual and so refreshing. And um, so yeah, like to me, I like, if there's any writers and directors watching, like I want more like romance, I want more love and less like sex, which is like a weird thing to say, but anyway.
I completely agree. I do. I completely agree. I'd love to actually see the longevity of a healthy relationship, because I feel like you spend maybe the best part of a film or a TV series going, will they, won't they? Will they, won't? And I love that. I'm still a sucker for that. But then they do, and either it's the end of whatever we're watching, or something goes terribly wrong, and maybe the opposite sex kind of, they meet the opposite sex and it throws them off, or whatever. But longevity of healthy relationships, that would be nice.
Yeah, agreed. What happens after happily ever after is, I think, far more interesting than how are they going to get together, right? It's like, how do you stay together when, you know, years go by and life throws at you all of the really big trials. And speaking to Brendan's point, I think that's absolutely right. I loved Ira Sachs's Passages because it was willing to go there with male sexual intimacy far more boldly than a lot of, you know, more mainstream work has been willing to do, and I think that's important. But in a sense, non-sexual intimacy is even more vulnerable making and important to see. So I certainly support that. I would also just say that I would love all of these recent MILF age gap romances, whatever we're calling them, where middle-aged women, you know, suddenly have their libidos, you know, reactivated by younger men. I'd like to mix that up a little bit and bring some more bisexual storylines into that particular cycle that we seem to be in the midst of. They're having their moment right now with Mrs. Fletcher and Baby Girl and Last Summer and what have you. So making that more kind of pointedly bisexual, I think would be helpful to inclusion for us.
Okay, next question. Any bonus tips for writing earlier period pieces where the label bisexuality didn't really exist and attitudes were different? That's from Anonymous.
that presents a really exciting opportunity to do some of the things that we talked about, where you don't necessarily say it, you show it. So through their actions, through what they look at, how they react to things, like all of those small things that you can pick up on without saying anything. I think that presents a really exciting opportunity to explore how you show it. And again, I agree with what Brendan said earlier about using your personal experiences. So you can always dig into that and be like, well, how is it actually that when I fancy someone, what do I do? How do I look at them, or how do I look away if they arrive? So yeah, I think that would be a way that I would at least try and work around that.
I don't have a direct answer, but I do have a recommendation. There's a film called The World to Come, and oh, excuse me, and it is, when is it set? Olden days. I'm just gonna say the olden days, like, and and it's about two married women, and they fall in love, and you see how that is and how they negotiate giant skirts. But that's a pretty, I was really quite taken back by that one, and I'm sure that's my suggestion.
And we have one last question. It's from Leia. The question is, can any of you think of any other really great examples of characters that present bisexuality in a non-stereotypical way in theatre or film or television?
I mentioned it earlier, but Schitt's Creek was the first TV show that I watched where I felt like there was a proper representation. If I remember correctly, that character identifies as pansexual and not bisexual. But I felt, and I don't even remember the main guy's character, but they show it so well, and they don't even, I think, use the label, but they talk about it through what kind of alcohol he prefers to drink, and that's kind of how he explains it. And there's no one that judges it. There's no one that is looking down upon it. It comes from a place of curiosity and openness rather than discrimination. So for me, that was the first time I saw something where I felt like I was being seen as a bisexual.
To piggyback off of that as well, there's two TV shows which are nothing to write home about, but they came out at the right time, or these storylines came out. The OC, Marissa Cooper and Olivia Wilde. Wow, that really, and also Olivia Wilde is actually a very well-rounded bisexual character who dates Seth and then dates Marissa, and then maybe a little less so Pretty Little Liars, Alison De Laurentiis, anyone. And I think, considering how mainstream and young adult that was, it certainly had an impact on me. Yeah.
While we're giving love to all the Canadian media like Schitt's Creek, I want to throw in for Mae Martin and Feel Good. I just love the first season of that show in particular, and just like a character really just like grappling with their developing understanding of who they are and what they want, and how that's, change, how is impacted by not just like their identity, but their trauma and their lived experience and their imperfections. And I think Maria talks about the great like disaster bisexual character, and Mae's character in that is fabulous and so rich and so textured and funny, and like what are you doing? But also like, oh, I get that, I've been there. So yeah, shout out to Mae Martin and Feel Good.
Yes, absolutely. Totally love Feel Good. Also, I would just give non-Desiree Akhavan shout outs to two other rom-coms. One is Puccini for Beginners, which is Maria Maginti. Early aughts, I would say. Really great screwball comedy with a bisexual protagonist. And Shiva Baby, which is more recent, by the person who made Bottoms, and which I think also, does a really good job of getting the experience of bisexuality as something that, necessitates your multiply occupying different worlds, and trying to keep yourself who you are in all of them.
Thank you all so much. That's all we have time for, and we went a little bit over, but I was told that was okay, so it's not my fault. Thank you, everyone. Thank
Thank you
you. I
everyone
don't
so
know.
much. You all have been amazing. Thank you, Verity, for hosting, and thank you to everyone on the panel and for our attendees for the amazing questions and all the comments in the chat. I've been keeping up. Just quickly wanted to let you know that we do have a feedback survey that will be sent in the chat, and it will also be sent via Eventbrite to all of our attendees. So please make sure to fill that out. We do appreciate your feedback, and we do read all of the submissions for that. And one final thing, we have an event coming up tomorrow that might be of interest to today's attendees. It is called Can I Afford to Work in the Screen Industries? It is on Zoom at 4 p.m. in a similar format as this event. So please make sure to check that out. And that's it for now. Thank you, everyone. Take care.